The wind howled different at 9,000 feet in the Medicine Bow Range. It wasn't just louder, it was angrier, meaner, like the mountain itself was trying to scrape every living thing off its frozen shoulders. November of 1842 came early that year, and it came hard. By the second week, the temperature had already dropped to 15 below zero at midday. By night, it plunged to depths that made a man's breath freeze in his lungs before he could exhale it fully. Thomas Hendricks felt that cold now, sitting inside his own cabin, wrapped in 2 wool blankets and a bearskin he'd traded 3 months of trapping for. He could see his breath. Inside. The fire in his stone hearth roared with split logs, consuming wood faster than he could feed it, and yet the heat seemed to vanish the moment it left the flames. The cabin walls, built thick with hand-hewn logs, chinked with moss and clay, seemed to do nothing but channel the cold inward. The floor planks, laid over packed earth, conducted the mountain's frozen core directly into his bones. Thomas was a practical man, 28 years old, born in Pennsylvania, raised in Kentucky, seasoned in the Rockies. He'd come west in the spring of 1840 with a company of trappers, but unlike most of them, he'd decided to stay. While others returned east with their pelts and their stories, Thomas had claimed this high valley, built this cabin with his own hands, and prepared to make a life in the wilderness. He knew timber, he knew stone, he knew how to build a proper frontier cabin, and by God, he'd built one. But as he sat there in the 4th week of that brutal winter, watching another armload of carefully split oak disappear into flames that seemed to heat nothing but the chimney stones, Thomas Hendricks faced a truth that gnawed at him worse than the cold. He was going to run out of firewood before February. And when that happened, he'd have 2 choices: pack up and abandon the valley he'd claimed, or freeze to death in the home he'd built. The stack outside told the story. When October ended, he'd had a wood pile that stood 8 feet high and stretched 20 feet along the north wall of his cabin. Good, seasoned wood, cut, split, and stacked through the summer and early fall. Enough, he'd calculated, to see him through even a hard winter. But this wasn't a hard winter. This was something else entirely. This was the kind of winter the old Arapaho trapper, Greyhawk, had warned him about, the kind that came once every generation and killed everything that wasn't prepared. Thomas had burned through 1/3 of his winter supply already, and November wasn't even over. At this rate, his calculations turned grim. He'd be completely out of wood by mid-January, with 2, maybe 3 months of killing cold still to endure. The forest below offered more timber, certainly, but it was a 2-mile trek down the mountainside through snow that was already waist-deep. Cutting, hauling, and splitting wood in those conditions would burn more calories than a man could replace, even if his supplies held out. And his supplies were another problem entirely. The venison he'd smoked hung in the small lean-to he'd built against the cabin's east wall. The cold kept it preserved, that much was true, but every time he ventured out to retrieve a piece, the wind tried to kill him. Frostbite had already claimed the tip of his left ear, and 2 of his fingers had gone white and numb last week. He'd warmed them by the fire for an hour, willing the blood back into the tissue, praying he wouldn't lose them. They'd come back, painful and swollen, but they'd come back. Next time, he might not be so fortunate. Thomas had built his cabin exactly the way every frontier guide and experienced woodsman had taught him. The structure followed the time-tested pattern that had sheltered settlers from New England to the Appalachians, from the Ohio Valley to the edge of the Rockies. It was a rectangle, 16 feet by 20 feet, with walls built from logs nearly a foot thick. He'd notched each log carefully, fitted them tight, and chinked every gap with a mixture of moss, grass, and clay that he'd harvested from the creek bed. The roof was solid, made from split shakes that he'd overlapped like scales on a fish, then covered with a layer of sod for insulation. He'd even built the floor up off the ground, laying planks over joists to keep the earth's cold from seeping directly into the living space. The fireplace was the cabin's heart, and Thomas had built it with particular care. He'd gathered river stones, flat and fitted, and constructed a hearth that measured 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The firebox could hold logs as long as his arm, and the chimney drew smoke perfectly, never back-drafting, never filling the cabin with eye-stinging haze. By every measure of frontier craftsmanship, it was a good fireplace, a proper fireplace. And yet it was utterly, catastrophically failing. The problem wasn't that the fire wouldn't burn. The fire burned magnificently. Thomas could pile in oak, pine, or aspen, and the flames would consume them with greedy enthusiasm, roaring and crackling and throwing out heat that he could feel on his face if he sat close enough. But that heat, that precious, life-sustaining warmth, it didn't stay. It didn't spread. It didn't fill the cabin the way it should. Instead, the heat rose straight up the chimney and vanished into the frozen night. Thomas had learned this the hard way during the first cold snap in October. He'd built a fire in the evening, watched it burn hot and bright, and then retreated to his bunk with confidence. 2 hours later, he'd woken shivering so hard his jaw ached. The fire was still burning, still consuming wood, still glowing red and orange, but the cabin temperature had dropped to barely above freezing. The stones around the firebox held some warmth, but only within arm's reach. Beyond that, the cold reigned absolute. He'd tried everything the conventional wisdom offered. He'd built larger fires, piling in more wood, creating infernos that made the stones glow. The result was the same: immediate heat near the hearth and bitter cold everywhere else. He'd tried smaller, longer-burning fires, laying logs carefully to create steady, sustained flames. Same result. He'd tried different types of wood, oak for its density and long burn time, pine for its quick heat, aspen because it was what he had the most of. None of it mattered. The fireplace ate wood, produced heat, and sent that heat straight up and out of his life. Thomas had even tried blocking the upper portion of the chimney with a metal plate he'd fashioned from an old cooking pot, thinking he could force more heat into the cabin by restricting the draft. That experiment had nearly killed him. Within minutes, smoke had poured back into the cabin thick and acrid, filling the space until he couldn't see, couldn't breathe. He'd stumbled to the door, thrown it open, and gasped in the frozen air while smoke billowed out around him. When he'd removed the metal plate, his eyes streaming and his lungs burning, he'd accepted what seemed like an immutable law of frontier life. A chimney that draws well can't heat well, and a chimney that heats well can't draw well. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The cabin had another problem, one that revealed itself during the brief warm spell in early November when the temperature had climbed to a balmy 25 degrees. Thomas had built his fire down to coals, letting the cabin warm naturally from the weak sunshine filtering through the oiled paper window. And that's when he noticed it. The cabin didn't just lose heat in the winter. In the summer, it would be an oven. The same thick log walls that failed to keep the cold out would trap heat in. The same roof that couldn't insulate against winter cold would bake under the summer sun. He realized, sitting there during that brief warm spell, that he'd built a structure that was perfectly designed to be miserable in every season, too cold in winter, too hot in summer, and the fireplace that was supposed to be the solution to the cold was actually part of the problem because it required so much wood that he'd spend his entire summer cutting and stacking just to survive the next winter. It was, he thought bitterly, a perfect trap. The cabin required the fireplace. The fireplace required massive amounts of wood. The wood required enormous labor to harvest, and the labor meant less time for hunting, less time for improving the property, less time for anything except the endless cycle of preparation for survival. And even with all that work, all that preparation, he was still cold, still burning through his supply, still facing the very real possibility of death. The stakes weren't abstract. Thomas had seen what the mountain winter could do. In late October, he'd found the frozen body of a young trapper named William Morrison, tucked into a hollow beneath a spruce tree 3 miles down the valley. William had been caught out during an early storm, had tried to wait it out in the shelter of the tree, and had simply never warmed up again. The cold had taken him quietly, peacefully even. He'd looked almost asleep when Thomas found him, curled on his side, hands tucked under his arms, frozen solid. Thomas had buried William as best he could, which meant covering the body with rocks in a shallow scrape, since the ground was already too frozen to dig properly. As he'd worked, stacking stones over the young man's body, he'd thought about how thin the margin was out here. William had been strong, capable, well-equipped. He'd had a good rifle, warm clothes, and experience in the wilderness. None of it had mattered. The cold didn't care about preparation. It didn't care about will or determination. It only cared about heat and whether you had enough of it. Now, in the 4th week of November, Thomas understood that he and William weren't so different. Thomas just had a few more layers of protection, a few more resources, a few more weeks before the cold would take him too. His firewood was vanishing at an unsustainable rate. Every morning he'd wake before dawn, feed the fire from the dwindling indoor stack he kept by the hearth, and then wait for enough light to venture outside. He'd carry in another armload, sometimes two, and watch the outdoor pile shrink by the day. He'd done the mathematics in his head 100 times, trying to find a solution in the numbers. At his current rate of consumption, he was burning approximately 1/4 cord of wood per week. His total supply had been about 6 cords, carefully stacked and seasoned. That meant, theoretically, 24 weeks of fire. But winter in the Medicine Bow Range lasted at least 28 weeks, sometimes 32. He'd calculated based on a milder winter, and this winter was anything but mild. Worse still, the cold was increasing his consumption. The colder it got, the more wood he needed to maintain even the inadequate heat his fireplace provided. It was a vicious spiral. Drop in temperature meant increase in wood consumption, which meant faster depletion of supply, which meant less cushion for unexpected cold snaps, which meant greater risk. He was watching his margin of survival shrink day by day, and there was nothing his conventional by-the-book cabin construction could do about it. The cabin had become a prison, and the fireplace had become his jailer. He spent his days feeding it, maintaining it, tending it like a demanding child that gave nothing back. Every few hours he'd add wood, not too much, or he'd waste the precious fuel, not too little, or the fire would die and he'd lose what little warmth he had. It was a constant calculation, a relentless attention to the flames, and even with all that care, he was still cold. The nights were worse. Thomas had developed a system, brutal in its efficiency. Before bed, he'd build up the fire as large as he dared, filling the firebox with logs. Then he'd pile every blanket and hide he owned onto his bunk, creating a nest that he'd burrow into, fully clothed, including his boots. Even then, he'd wake multiple times each night, driven from sleep by the cold, to add more wood to the dying fire. This meant keeping a supply right next to his bed, which meant tracking snow and ice into his sleeping area, which meant his blankets were always slightly damp, which meant they insulated less effectively. The exhaustion was accumulating. Broken sleep, constant physical labor, inadequate calories from his dwindling food supply, and the relentless stress of managing the cold, it was grinding him down. Thomas could feel it in his body. He was losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. His hands shook slightly when he worked. His thoughts sometimes seemed slow, as if the cold was freezing his mind along with his body. And the fire kept burning, kept consuming, kept demanding more wood, while giving back so little warmth. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, surrounded by one of the largest forests in North America, with millions of trees stretching in every direction, and he was going to freeze to death for lack of firewood. Not because there wasn't enough wood in the world, but because his fireplace was so inefficient, so wasteful, that even the abundance of the frontier couldn't keep pace with its appetite. The conventional wisdom had failed him. Every guidebook, every experienced frontiersman, every settler he'd spoken with had agreed on the basics of frontier survival. Build a solid cabin with thick walls. Construct a good stone fireplace with a strong draft. Cut and stack plenty of wood. Keep your fire burning. These weren't suggestions. They were the foundation of winter survival in the wilderness, tested and proven across generations, across thousands of miles of frontier. And they weren't working. Thomas sat in his well-built cabin, in front of his properly constructed fireplace, burning his carefully prepared wood supply, and he was still losing. The mountain was still winning, and unless something changed, unless he could find a way to break free from this failing system, the mountain would take him the same way it had taken William Morrison. It was December 3rd when Thomas Hendricks faced the full weight of his situation. He'd gone outside at first light to assess his woodpile, and the sight had stopped him cold in more ways than one. The stack that had seemed substantial just weeks ago now looked pathetic, diminished, pitifully inadequate. He'd burned through half his supply. Half. And the real winter hadn't even arrived yet. The Arapaho trappers talked about the white death moon that came in January, when the temperature could drop to 40, 50, even 60 below zero, when the air itself seemed to crystallize and fall from the sky like powdered glass. If Thomas continued at his current rate, he'd be out of wood by Christmas. Out of wood, with the worst cold still ahead, with no way to cut more without exposing himself to fatal conditions, with no one within 50 miles to help him, and no realistic possibility of hiking out through the deep snow and murderous cold. He was trapped, truly trapped, and his prison was a cabin that should have been his salvation, heated by a fireplace that should have been his lifeline, both of them built according to the accepted wisdom of frontier survival. That night, after adding another precious log to the eternally hungry fire, Thomas lay in his bunk and stared at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. The wind shrieked outside, a sound that had become so constant he barely noticed it anymore. His breath plumed in the air above his face. Ice had formed on the inside of the cabin walls, a thin crystalline layer that glistened in the firelight. He thought about William Morrison, frozen under his pile of stones. He thought about how easily it would be to simply stop fighting, to let the fire die, to lie down and let the cold take him. But Thomas Hendricks wasn't built to quit. His father had been a Scots-Irish immigrant who'd carved a farm out of the Pennsylvania wilderness with nothing but an axe, a rifle, and a stubbornness that bordered on the supernatural. His mother had been the daughter of a Lenape woman and a French trapper, and she'd taught him things that other frontier children never learned. She'd taught him to observe, to watch, to learn from what the land was telling him. The wilderness doesn't lie, she told him when he was young. It doesn't trick you or deceive you. It just shows you the truth, and whether you see it or not is up to you. Thomas lay there in the cold and thought about truth. The truth was that his fireplace didn't work, not because it was built wrong, but because the fundamental design was flawed. The truth was that conventional frontier wisdom, tested across thousands of cabins and hundreds of years, was based on settlements in forests with milder winters. Pennsylvania winters were hard, but they weren't Medicine Bow Range winters. Kentucky cold was real, but it wasn't 9,000-foot mountain cold. The truth was that the accepted way of doing things worked fine in most places, but this wasn't most places. This was the edge of survivability, and the old methods weren't enough. So Thomas began to observe, not with panic, not with the desperate thrashing of a man drowning, but with the careful, patient attention his mother had taught him. He watched the fire, really watched it. Not just the flames, but the way the heat moved. He could see it if he paid attention. The way the hot air rose from the flames in shimmering waves, traveled straight up, and disappeared into the chimney. The heat wasn't spreading through the cabin, it was escaping from the cabin. The fireplace wasn't a heater, it was a heat pump, extracting warmth from his wood and ejecting it into the frozen sky. He got up from his bunk, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and crouched by the hearth. He held his hand at different heights, different distances. The heat was intensely concentrated right at the fire, but it dropped off dramatically within a few feet. Straight up, the chimney stones were almost too hot to touch, but the stones on either side of the firebox, just inches away from where the flames burned, were merely warm. The heat was going up, not out. Thomas thought about chimneys. A good chimney draws because hot air rises. The hotter the air in the chimney, the stronger the draft. But that same draft that made his fireplace burn so cleanly was also stealing his heat. Every cubic foot of hot air that rushed up the chimney was replaced by a cubic foot of cold air sucking in from every crack and gap in the cabin. He wasn't just losing the heat from the fire, he was actively pulling cold air into his living space. The fireplace was creating a convection current that worked against him. Over the next several days, Thomas observed everything. He watched smoke. When he first lit the fire each morning, before the chimney stones heated up, the smoke sometimes edged out into the cabin, moving sluggishly, but once the stones warmed and the draft strengthened, the smoke vanished straight up with almost violent speed. He watched his breath. The plumes of condensation that formed when he exhaled showed the air currents in the cabin. He could see cold air flowing along the floor toward the fire, being pulled into the combustion. He could see the river of cold that poured in from the doorframe, from the window, from every imperfection in his chinking. He thought about the cabins he'd seen in the lower valleys, the way frontier families dealt with heat. Most of them, he realized, didn't deal with it well at all. They just burned enormous amounts of wood and accepted being cold. The wealthy ones in the settlements had started using iron stoves, shipped at great expense from the east, but even those were relatively new innovations. For most of frontier history, people had simply endured, and many of them had died from the cold, their deaths attributed to bad luck or divine will rather than inadequate heating technology. But Thomas thought about other cultures, other peoples. The Arapaho didn't build cabins like his. They used teepees, conical structures that could be heated efficiently with small fires. He'd spent time in a teepee the previous winter, trading with Gray Hawk, and he'd been amazed at how warm it had been inside despite the minimal fire. The smoke hole at the top could be adjusted with poles, controlling the draft, and the shape of the structure seemed to hold heat better than his rectangular cabin. But he couldn't build a teepee, couldn't abandon the cabin he'd worked so hard to construct. He thought about his mother's stories of the old French trappers, how they'd sometimes built their winter shelters half underground, using the earth as insulation. He thought about the root cellars he'd dug on his father's farm, how they stayed cool in summer and merely cold, rather than frozen, in winter. The earth had thermal mass, he realized. It stored temperature and released it slowly. His cabin had no thermal mass. The thin log walls gained and lost heat quickly, and the air inside had almost no capacity to store warmth. Thomas spent hours staring at his fireplace, thinking about heat and air and stone and wood, and slowly, almost reluctantly, an idea began to form. It was crazy. It went against everything he'd been taught. Other frontiersmen would laugh at him if they knew what he was considering. But the more he thought about it, the more he observed the behavior of heat and air in his cabin, the more sense it made. The problem wasn't that the fire didn't make enough heat. The problem was that the heat wasn't being captured, stored, and distributed. The stones of his fireplace were right there, absorbing some heat, but most of the thermal energy was racing up the chimney before the stones could capture it. What if he could force the heat to spend more time in contact with the stone mass? What if he could create a structure that would absorb the heat from the fire, store it in the stones, and then radiate that stored heat into the cabin long after the fire died down? But how? He couldn't just narrow the chimney. He'd already learned that lesson with his metal plate experiment. The fire needed oxygen, needed draft. restrict the airflow too much, and the fire would produce smoke instead of heat, would smolder instead of burning cleanly. The solution had to allow for proper combustion while somehow capturing more heat. Thomas lay awake that night, his mind racing despite his exhaustion. He thought about the path of the smoke, up from the fire, straight up the chimney, gone. What if the path wasn't straight? What if the smoke had to travel through a longer channel, one that wound through more stone, transferring more heat before exiting? The draft would still work, hot air would still rise, but it would have to rise through a maze of stone rather than a direct vertical shaft. He sat up in his bunk, his breath pluming in the cold air. The Koreans, he suddenly remembered. There had been a merchant in Independence, Missouri, a man who traveled to the Orient and back. He'd told stories about the strange heating systems in Korean homes, floors that were warm because the smoke from the fire traveled underneath them before exiting through a chimney at the far end of the house. Thomas had dismissed it at the time as an exotic curiosity, interesting but irrelevant, but now it seemed like the most relevant thing in the world. He couldn't build a Korean heated floor, not in his existing cabin, but he could adapt the principle. He could create a path for the smoke that would transfer heat to stone, and that stone would then heat the cabin. He'd need to rebuild his fireplace, partially dismantle it, and reconstruct it with a different internal structure. It would be risky, dangerous even, to work with stone in the bitter cold, but it was either try this or die. Those were his options. The next morning, December 7th, Thomas began to plan his innovation in earnest. He sat at his rough-hewn table, a piece of charcoal in hand, sketching on a board. His fireplace was 4 feet wide. What if he built a secondary chamber behind and above the main firebox, a chamber made of stone with a passage that forced the smoke to travel horizontally before rising? The hot smoke would heat the stones of this chamber, and those stones would radiate heat into the cabin for hours. But there was more to it. Thomas had been thinking about his wood problem, and a radical idea had occurred to him. What if he didn't need to burn large logs at all? What if small wood, twigs even, could produce enough heat if the system captured and stored it efficiently? Small wood had advantages. It was abundant, easy to gather, dried quickly, and burned hot and fast. The problem with small wood in a conventional fireplace was that it burned too quickly and sent all its heat up the chimney before you could benefit from it. But if he had a system that could capture that fast, hot heat and store it in thermal mass, then small wood might actually be superior to large logs. His plan began to take detailed shape. He would need to keep the main firebox, but reduce its size. A smaller, more intense fire would actually produce hotter combustion, which meant more complete burning and less waste. From the firebox, the smoke would enter a horizontal channel, perhaps 8 inches tall, and the full width of the fireplace. This channel would run along the back of the fireplace, then turn and run forward again on the other side. The smoke would travel through this maze, and then finally exit through a chimney that was offset from the firebox. Every inch of that path would be lined with stone, and that stone would absorb the heat. There was a beautiful elegance to it. Instead of the heat escaping immediately, it would be traded to the stones. The stones would heat slowly, but hold that heat for hours, radiating it into the cabin long after the fire had burned down to ash. And because the system would be so efficient, he wouldn't need massive fires burning all day and night. He could burn smaller fires for shorter periods, and the thermal mass would carry him through. The twigs suddenly made perfect sense. He could gather an armload of twigs, small branches, dead wood that was everywhere in the forest, in a fraction of the time it took to cut, split, and haul a large log. He could burn them hot and fast in his reduced firebox. Let the system capture that heat, and then let the fire die down. 2 or 3 times a day, he'd burn a quick, hot fire, and the stones would keep the cabin warm between burns. His wood consumption would drop dramatically, his labor would decrease, and he'd actually be warmer. But Thomas knew the idea was going to sound insane to anyone he described it to. Burn twigs? Heat with small wood? Everyone knew you needed big logs for real heat. Everyone knew that a proper fire needed to burn constantly. Everyone knew that thermal mass was what made a cabin cold, not what made it warm. If he told this plan to another frontiersman, they'd think he'd gone mad from cold and isolation. They'd tell him he was going to freeze himself to death with his foolishness. He could imagine the conversation. You want to make your firebox smaller? You want to add more stone that'll take forever to heat up? You want to burn twigs instead of proper logs? Thomas, you're going to kill yourself. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe this whole idea was the delusion of a desperate man, a last gasp of false hope before the inevitable end. But Thomas didn't think so. The more he studied his sketches, the more he thought about the principles, the more convinced he became that this would work. There was one more element to his plan, something that had come to him while observing the way cold air flowed along his cabin floor. If he raised his firebox off the floor just a foot or so, he could create a space underneath where cold air could enter, be heated, and rise into the cabin. This would create a convection current, but one he controlled, one that worked for him instead of against him. Cold air would flow under the firebox, get heated by the stones there, and rise as warm air. Meanwhile, the hot smoke from the fire would be traveling through the stone channels, heating the main thermal mass. Two sources of heat from one fire, the direct convection of air beneath and the radiant heat from the stones. Thomas spent another full day refining his plan, thinking through every detail. He'd need to partially dismantle his existing fireplace, which meant he'd be without heat for days while he rebuilt. He'd have to do this work in brutal cold, handling frozen stones with hands that could barely feel. He'd need clay for mortar, which meant chipping through ice to get to the creek bed. He'd need flat stones that fit precisely, creating channels that would draw properly without leaking smoke into the cabin. The risks were enormous. If he dismantled the fireplace and then couldn't get his new design to work, he'd have no heat source at all. He'd freeze within days. If the new chimney didn't draw, he'd fill the cabin with smoke and have to rebuild everything again, wasting precious days in the cold. If the thermal mass principle didn't work the way he thought, he'd have destroyed a functioning fireplace and replaced it with an elaborate failure. Every part of this plan carried risk, and the penalty for failure was death. But on December 10th, with his wood supply down to less than a quarter of what he'd started with, Thomas made his decision. He was going to do it. He was going to dismantle his conventional fireplace and rebuild it according to his own design, his own theory, his own observations of how heat behaved. He was going to bet his life on the idea that the accepted way wasn't the only way, and that sometimes the wisdom that worked everywhere else wasn't wisdom at all in a place like this. The work began the next morning. Thomas started a large fire in the fireplace, heating the stones as much as possible. Then he let it burn down to coals and carefully removed them to a metal bucket. With the firebox empty, he began the delicate process of dismantling the upper portions of his chimney. Each stone had to be worked free without disturbing the structural integrity of the pieces he was keeping. It was brutally cold work. His hands were numb within minutes, even wrapped in strips of wool. The stones were often frozen together by moisture that had seeped into the clay mortar, and he had to chip carefully with a small hammer and chisel. By the end of the first day, he'd removed the upper section of the chimney and begun to expose the back wall of the firebox. The cabin was bitterly cold without the fire, and Thomas had to work in short bursts, warming himself with heated stones wrapped in cloth, then returning to the demolition. He didn't sleep that night, couldn't risk it. Instead, he huddled under his blankets, occasionally putting hot stones from his bucket into his bed to stave off the worst of the cold. The second day he continued the careful dismantling and began to excavate clay from the creek. This was nightmarish work. The creek was frozen solid, and he had to chop through ice with his axe, then dig into the partially frozen mud beneath. His hands were split and bleeding by midday, but he got the clay, enough to make mortar, and he hauled it back to the cabin in a canvas sack. The third day was when the real construction began. Thomas built his new, smaller firebox, perhaps 2/3 the size of his original. Behind this firebox, he constructed the first horizontal channel, using flat stones to create a space about 8 inches high and running the width of the fireplace. The smoke would enter this channel from the top of the firebox, travel horizontally across, then turn and come back in a parallel channel just above the first one. He built these channels with painstaking care, making sure they were sealed but not restricted, allowing airflow but forcing maximum contact with the stone. Above these channels, he built a large stone chamber, a box of thermal mass that would absorb heat from the smoke passing below it. This chamber was the key to the whole system, hundreds of pounds of stone that would heat slowly but hold that heat for hours. On the fourth day, he completed the maze of channels and began to build the new chimney, offset from the firebox, positioned so that smoke had to travel through all the channels before finding its exit. On the fifth day, he added the final crucial element. He raised the entire firebox structure on stones, creating a space underneath about 10 inches high. This space was open at the front, facing into the cabin. Cold air could flow into this space, be heated by the stones of the firebox floor, and rise into the room. He used smaller stones and careful mortar work to ensure this air passage was properly shaped. By the evening of the fifth day, December 16th, Thomas Hendricks looked at his completed fireplace. It looked strange, nothing like a conventional frontier hearth. The firebox was small, almost too small. The structure was bulky, with the stone chamber rising behind the firebox. The chimney emerged from an odd angle. If another frontiersman walked into his cabin, they'd think he'd built it wrong, that he'd made a mess of what should have been simple. But Thomas wasn't building for other frontiersmen. He was building for survival. He was building based on observation and principle, not tradition. And now, after 5 days without heat, 5 days of brutal labor in life-threatening cold, 5 days of risk and doubt and determination, it was time to see if his crazy idea would work. It was time to light the fire. Thomas had gathered twigs during his clay expeditions, bundles of dried deadwood from beneath the shelter of spruce trees. They ranged from pencil-thin to thumb-thick, none of them more than 2 feet long. This was his fuel now, the twigs that were supposed to heat his entire cabin. He arranged them in the small firebox, creating a structure that would allow air to flow, would burn hot and fast. He'd saved a few pieces of larger wood, proper split logs, and he had a terrible feeling he was going to need them when this failed. He used a coal from his bucket to light the kindling, and flames caught immediately. The dry twigs burned eagerly, and within minutes he had a vigorous fire going in the reduced firebox. Smoke rose from the flames, and Thomas held his breath, watching it. Would it flow through his channels, or would it pour back into the cabin? For a long moment the smoke seemed confused, unsure which way to go. Then the draft established itself, and the smoke vanished smoothly into the horizontal channel at the back of the firebox. Thomas watched the chimney top from his door. A thin stream of smoke emerged, rising into the cold dawn air. The draft was working. The fire was burning cleanly. So far, so good. He returned to the firebox and added more twigs, feeding the eager flames. The fire burned hot, hotter than his old large log fires had burned. The concentrated flames in the smaller space created intense heat, and Thomas could feel it radiating from the front of the firebox. But the real question was what would happen to the thermal mass. Would the stones heat up? Would they store the energy? Would they radiate it into the cabin? Thomas couldn't tell yet. It was too soon. He kept the fire burning for about 45 minutes, feeding it twigs continuously, learning the rhythm of this new system. Then he let it die down. He didn't extinguish it, just stopped adding fuel. The last twigs burned to glowing coals, and then even those faded to ash. Thomas sat at his table and waited. The front of the firebox was very warm, almost hot to the touch, but that was just residual heat from the fire. The real test was the stone mass, the chamber he'd built above and behind the firebox. He placed his hand against it. It was warm, but not dramatically so. He waited. 10 minutes passed, 20. He put his hand on the stones again. They were warmer, noticeably warmer. The heat was building in the mass, slowly but steadily. After an hour, the stones of the chamber were genuinely hot. Not fire hot, not painful to touch, but hot enough that he couldn't keep his hand on them for more than a few seconds. And the cabin, he suddenly realized, was warmer than it had been in weeks. Not just near the fireplace, but throughout the space. He walked to the far corner, the corner that was usually bitterly cold, and he could feel warmth. Not summer warmth, not comfortable warmth, but warmth. The temperature had risen. Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in months, hope. He waited another hour, not lighting another fire, just observing. The stones stayed hot. The cabin stayed warmer than it should be. At the 2-hour mark, he went outside to gather more twigs. It took him less than 5 minutes to collect an armload, and he brought them inside with a sense of growing excitement. At the 3-hour mark, he lit another fire. This burn was similar to the first, a hot, fast fire that consumed twigs eagerly. He fed it for about 30 minutes this time, feeling the rhythm, understanding what the system needed. Then he let it die again. And again he waited. The thermal mass cycle was repeating. The stones were capturing the heat from the hot, fast fire, storing it, and radiating it slowly into the cabin. This time, the stones heated faster because they were starting from a warmer baseline. By the time the second fire had died to ash, the cabin was genuinely comfortable. Not warm, Thomas was still wearing his coat, but comfortable, livable. The temperature inside was probably in the high 40s, maybe even 50 degrees. Outside it was 10 below zero. Over the next 3 days, Thomas refined his technique. He learned that 2 burns in the morning, about an hour apart, would heat the stones enough to carry him through most of the day with only 1 more burn in the afternoon. He learned that the fire burned best when he arranged the twigs loosely, allowing air to circulate. He learned that slightly green wood actually worked fine in this system because the intense heat dried it quickly. He learned that the space under the firebox did indeed create a convection current, warming air that rose into the cabin, providing a secondary heat source. On December 20th, Thomas was warm, genuinely warm. He was wearing just a single layer of clothing inside the cabin. The temperature was comfortable, the air was breathable, and he wasn't constantly feeding a voracious fire. Instead, he made 3 trips outside each day, gathered armloads of twigs, and burned them in short, hot fires. Each fire lasted less than an hour. Each fire consumed a fraction of what his old system had required. And, between fires, the stones radiated steady, comfortable heat. His wood consumption had dropped by more than 80%. The quarter cord of split logs he'd had remaining would now last him through March. As a backup supply he likely wouldn't even need. The forest around his cabin provided unlimited twigs, dead wood that required no cutting, no splitting, just gathering. He could collect a day's worth of fuel in less than half an hour. The brutal cycle of wood preparation that had consumed his summer was broken. The desperate arithmetic of winter survival had changed completely. But the real test came on December 27th, when the temperature dropped to 43 below zero. The wind came down from the north with such force that it drove ice crystals through microscopic gaps in the cabin walls, creating a fine mist inside. Thomas woke before dawn to a cold that seemed to have physical weight. This was the white death moon Greyhawk had warned him about, and it had arrived with a vengeance. Thomas had wondered if his system would hold up to extreme cold or if he'd been fooling himself during the merely very cold temperatures of earlier December. He built his morning fires, 2 burns with good hot flames. The twigs burned beautifully even in the savage cold. The thermal mass absorbed the heat, and the cabin stayed warm. Not as warm as it had been during the mild days, but warm enough. The temperature inside never dropped below 40 degrees, even when the outside temperature hit its brutal low. Thomas realized, sitting at his table, while the wind tried to tear his cabin apart, that he'd done something extraordinary. He'd taken a failing system, analyzed it, understood its weaknesses, and rebuilt it according to first principles rather than convention. He'd created a heating method that was more efficient, more sustainable, and more effective than anything the frontier had developed. And he'd done it with twigs, with fuel that other men would kick aside as useless kindling. The winter continued, but Thomas Hendricks thrived. He gained back the weight he'd lost. His hands healed. He slept through the nights, warm and comfortable. He even began working on improvements to his cabin, small projects that had been impossible when all his energy went into simple survival. He carved, he wrote, he thought. The cabin that had been a prison became a home. Word of Thomas's system spread slowly, the way news travels in the wilderness. In February, a trapper named Jacob Weatherby stumbled upon Thomas's cabin during a storm. Jacob had expected to find a frozen corpse or an empty cabin. Instead, he found a warm, comfortable space heated by a strange fireplace that burned nothing but twigs. Thomas fed Jacob dinner, let him warm up, and explained his system. Jacob was skeptical until he felt the heat, saw the modest fuel consumption, and understood the principles. Jacob carried the story to the trading post at Fort William, 50 miles to the northeast. He described the twig stove and the crazy frontiersman who'd invented it. Some listeners scoffed, others were intrigued. By the following winter, 3 trappers had modified their fireplaces using Thomas's principles. All 3 reported dramatic reductions in wood consumption and significant improvements in heat. The idea began to spread. Over the next few years, Thomas's heating method, often called the Hendricks system, or simply the thermal mass hearth, became common knowledge among high-altitude trappers and settlers. The design was adapted and improved. Some men added multiple channels, increasing the thermal mass further. Others experimented with different configurations, finding ways to integrate the system into various cabin designs. But the core principles remained: hot, fast fires in a small firebox, smoke traveling through stone channels, thermal mass storing and radiating heat, and small wood as the primary fuel. The innovation had implications beyond just comfort. The reduced labor requirements meant settlers could spend more time hunting, trapping, and improving their properties. The decreased wood consumption meant forests around settlements weren't stripped bare, maintaining the ecological balance. The reliable heat meant fewer deaths from cold, fewer amputations from frostbite, fewer miseries from constant exposure to brutal temperatures. Thomas's observation and ingenuity had changed the equation of frontier survival. But perhaps the most significant impact was philosophical rather than practical. Thomas's system proved that conventional wisdom, no matter how time-tested, wasn't sacred. It showed that observation and thought could trump tradition and authority. It demonstrated that innovation could come from anyone, anywhere, if they were willing to look carefully at what was actually happening rather than what everyone said should be happening. Thomas never sought recognition for his invention. He lived in his valley for another 23 years, trapping and trading, occasionally taking on apprentices who wanted to learn wilderness skills. He taught them his heating system, but more importantly, he taught them the principle behind it: observe the truth, question the assumptions, and have the courage to try something new when the old way isn't working. The wilderness doesn't lie, he'd tell them, echoing his mother's words. It shows you what's real. Your job is to pay attention. When Thomas died in 1865 at the age of 51, peacefully in his sleep, his cabin was still warm. The fireplace he had built 2 decades earlier was still functioning perfectly, still heating with twigs, still defying what everyone had once known was impossible. He was buried in the valley he'd claimed, under a simple marker made from the same river stones he'd used to build his revolutionary hearth. The lesson of Thomas Hendricks extends far beyond frontier heating. It's about the courage to question, the wisdom to observe, and the determination to act on what you learn even when it contradicts accepted truth. The frontier was full of men who did things the way they'd always been done, who followed the rules and repeated the patterns. Most of them survived, some of them thrived. But it was the few, the ones like Thomas, who looked at failure and asked why, who looked at convention and asked what if, who fundamentally changed what was possible. His heating system became a small but significant thread in the tapestry of frontier innovation. It joined other examples of applied observation. The efficient water wheel designs that powered early mills, the crop rotation methods that maintained soil fertility, the food preservation techniques that prevented starvation, the construction methods that created buildings capable of withstanding extremes. All of these innovations shared a common origin, someone who paid attention to what was actually happening rather than what everyone said should happen. Thomas's story reminds us that innovation isn't about genius or inspiration striking from nowhere. It's about observation, patience, and the willingness to experiment even when the stakes are high. He didn't invent new physics or discover unknown principles. Heat rises, thermal mass stores energy, small wood burns hot. These were all known facts. What Thomas did was combine them in a new way, applying them to solve a specific problem that conventional methods couldn't address. The frontier demanded this kind of thinking because the margin for error was so thin. A failed harvest meant starvation. A poorly built shelter meant death by cold or heat. A mistake in reading weather patterns could trap you in a blizzard. The wilderness didn't grade on a curve or give second chances. You learned, you adapted, you innovated, or you died. This crucible of necessity forced men like Thomas to think deeply, observe carefully, and act boldly. But the principles don't only apply to survival in the wilderness. They apply anywhere that conventional wisdom isn't delivering the results you need. Whether you're building a business, creating art, solving a technical problem, or navigating a personal challenge, the lesson is the same. Observe what's actually happening, question why it's happening that way, understand the underlying principles, and have the courage to try something different when different is what's needed. Thomas Hendricks heated his cabin with twigs because he understood that the problem wasn't the fuel, it was the system. He rebuilt his fireplace because he recognized that a tool that works everywhere else might not work here. He survived the winter because he trusted his observations more than he trusted tradition. And in doing so, he didn't just save his own life, he created knowledge that saved others. The Hendricks system eventually faded from widespread use as manufactured iron stoves became available and affordable, bringing factory efficiency to frontier heating. But the principle lived on. Engineers designing modern passive solar homes use the same thermal mass concepts Thomas discovered in his frozen cabin. The idea of capturing waste heat and storing it for later use drives technologies from heat recovery ventilators to thermal battery systems. The observation that small, frequent hot fires can be more efficient than large, continuous cool fires informs everything from rocket mass heaters to modern wood gasification systems. Thomas never knew his innovation would echo through the centuries. He was just trying not to freeze to death. But that's often how real innovation works. It's not about changing the world. It's about solving the problem in front of you with the resources and knowledge you have. The world-changing part is a consequence, not a goal. Thomas changed the world by changing his fireplace. He influenced history by surviving one winter. He became a teacher by learning one lesson. That lesson is this: the truth is in the observation, not in the authority. The solution is in the principles, not in the precedent. The power to innovate isn't reserved for experts or geniuses. It belongs to anyone willing to look carefully, think clearly, and act courageously. Thomas Hendricks was just a frontiersman with a problem, but he was also a scientist, an engineer, and an innovator. He didn't need credentials or permission to question the conventional wisdom. He just needed eyes to see what was happening and the determination to do something about it. The cabin still stands, though barely. The roof collapsed years ago, and the walls are slowly returning to the earth. But the fireplace remains, its stones still arranged in that peculiar configuration, still showing the channels where smoke once traveled, still bearing witness to the winter when one man refused to accept that things had to be the way they'd always been. It's a monument not to a person, but to a way of thinking, a reminder that the wilderness teaches those who pay attention, that observation trumps assumption, and that sometimes the impossible is just the not yet tried. So when you face your own impossible winter, when the conventional methods are failing and the experts are telling you there's no other way, remember Thomas Hendricks in his cabin at 9,000 feet, feeding twigs into a fireplace no one else believed would work. Remember that he stayed warm by staying observant, that he survived by thinking rather than by accepting, and that he thrived by combining knowledge from many sources into something new. The lesson isn't about heating systems or frontier survival. The lesson is about the power of careful observation, the value of understanding principles, and the necessity of innovation when the old ways aren't enough. That lesson, forged in the frozen heart of the Medicine Bow Range, remains as relevant today as it was in the brutal winter of 1842, and it will remain relevant as long as humans face challenges that demand more than convention can provide.